All right. Hey, what's up, y'all? It's your boy Preston here. And basically this is my well, obviously this is my prediction for Floyd Schofield versus Tevin Farmer. And I'm actually like I've been waiting like out of all of the fights on the card, like I'm more excited about this fight, and like for real, like I'm more excited about this fight, and shit like that cuz Schofield, he's young, like he got, he got good skill, he got some power, and shit like that, Tevin Farmer, he got his experience, he also has great boxing skill, excuse me, but he has great boxing skill, and he also, can also, even though he only got 6 knockouts, but he could still like catch, but he could still like he has some power though, and shit like that, like if you don't know what you're doing and shit like that, he could definitely catch you off guard, like just like how he did against William Zepeda, but yeah, man, this is a very good fight, and I'm definitely looking forward to this fight, and shit like that, and like it's just like I don't really have a fighter that I'm really like going for in this fight because realistically, like I think both of these fighters are evenly matched and shit like that. I like what these fighters bring to the table, and shit like that. And even though I'm not fully a fan because because that's a different word, and shit like that when it comes down to me, and shit like that, but you know but they both showcase a lot of skill, and shit like that impresses me and shit like that, and just this is gonna be bring a very good fight, man, very very good fight, and stuff like that, because like overall, like I just don't think any of these fighters are gonna go down very easily, and shit like that, Farmer, Farmer proves that he has a good chin, and shit like that. Like the only time he's been, because I think he only got stopped like twice. I know one of them was against Jose Petraza way back in the day when they both were in their primes, and stuff like that, But he got stopped by Petraza, like honestly, I wouldn't mind seeing a rematch, but anyways, and shit like that, like that was his only like time when he got stopped, and stuff like that, and either way, that is a big question. Getting stopped by Petraza, because I mean, like, but overall, I feel like both Floyd Schofield and Petraza's punching is on the same level because Petraza also had a good amount of power with his punching. He just more had a lot of speed with his punching, and shit like that, And that's the thing. Schofield more shows more of power punching, and stuff like that, So they're both around like the same, field, and shit like that for Tevin Farmer, and stuff like that, And that's the thing and shit like that, But this is a very big test for Floyd Schofield because Schofield hasn't fought in like I would say almost a year, and stuff like that, So it's been a minute since he's got in the ring, and shit like that, And obviously he was supposed to fight Shakur, and that didn't turn out, well, because he got sick, and shit like that, And obviously, like with my videos before, like, I was saying how he got poisoned and shit, which I mean he definitely could have, and shit like that, because it's just because more of my reason is because like Dubois literally got like Dubois had the same thing happen to him like what was it like the same day or the day before or after or whatever it was on the like either way it was close together of when both fighters got sick, so it's like that's why. And the thing is that Dubois, who was Dubois, what was Dubois fighting at the time, and shit like that, like he fought shoot, like who, hold up, Joseph Parker, that's who it was, so basically like that would honestly that would have been a good ass fight. I still want to see that fight though, but but basically like that's what was supposed to happen, and basically like Dubois, like he got sick or whatever and shit like that. But it's just the one thing that I'm questioning about that is that like why would they poison Dubois, and shit like that, it's like because it's like I know this is like a video about not about this right here, not Daniel Dubois, but it's just more of like how would they poison Daniel Dubois, and shit like that, because it's like going against Joseph Parker, like, wouldn't, like, because I had him beating Joseph Parker, and shit like that. I feel like it was gonna be, a tough fight, and shit like that. Or I think I had him beating, yeah, yeah, like I thought it was gonna be a tough fight, but I thought it was gonna be a matter of time until either the punches are gonna start just getting too much, like it's gonna just accumulate a lot where it's gonna start really hurting, Joseph Parker, or he would have got just knocked out. It's like he would have like been winning, and shit like that, or it would have been a good fight, and then he would have just got knocked out. He would have not lasted against Daniel Dubois, and I still right now would have that same prediction that Dubois beats Joseph Parker, and shit like that, and excuse me, and shit like that, but but like honestly, that app is like a piece of shit, and shit like that, but like, but it does, but anyways, and shit like that, but I'm just saying though, and shit like that, but what I was saying is that basically like the app that like is like a tracker thing, and shit like that for like family and shit like that, girlfriends, and shit like that, and shit, but niggas single, and shit like that. But I'm just saying with those type of things and shit because I'm overprotective. But basically, that's the thing and shit like that, man, and shit like that, fuck, what was I saying, bro? Oh yeah, because with Joseph Parker, it's like, you know, that's the thing with Joseph Parker and shit like that. It's like, he's a good fighter, but he would have not be, Daniel Dubois. But that's why I'm thinking, like, Daniel Dubois would have been the A side fighter in that fight, and shit like that. Like, he would have been the A side fighter, and shit like that, So that's the thing and shit like that, like he would have been the A side fighter. So I'm like, if he would have been the A side fighter, why would they poison him and shit like that, unless if they're just like, like they're very strict on wanting, to have, like fighters from New Zealand, and shit like that, showcase and shit like that, which I mean, I can understand that, and shit, but it just still, you can't do that, and stuff like that, but it's just more of like, is that true, and shit like that. It's just like, I just don't know and shit like that, I like, it could have been just really coincidental, and shit like that, or it could have just like, it's just like, I'm just very 50-50 about it. But if I would say what what I more think of now, I just don't know, but I just don't think they would like if because if they wouldn't poison Daniel Dubois, like if they wouldn't poison Daniel Dubois, they're not gonna poison Floyd Schofield. So, and I don't think that they poisoned, like I just think it was a coincidental sickness. They caught a sickness of somebody over there or some shit, or something, or just their climate over there isn't the greatest or something. I don't know. It can be many of things and shit like that, but it just, I don't know if they got poisoned intentionally by the promotion, of Riyadh, but but again, like I would like it could be, it's 50-50, man. Like it just like it like just like I said, like, but if I'm leaning more towards something, I wouldn't think that they would. But again, it's 50-50 because you never know. Like it's just, that's way too coincidental for that to happen, and stuff like that, and that's the thing and stuff like that, and I'm just saying, that's way too coincidental for that to happen, and shit like that, and yeah, and stuff like that, but but yeah, and stuff like that, but onto like, what onto basically like what these, what the fighters keys are, and shit like that, like what their talents are, and then everything else. But I'm just ending this clip. So like, I know I already said this and shit, but actually before I say, actually the fighters, well, basically, like, I know I already basically talked about the fighters and shit like that, with their skill sets, but but the main thing that I was like, of the main topic that I'm trying to bring, or the main agenda of what I'm trying to bring and shit like that, with Floyd Schofield with Daniel Dubois situation, is that, again, if Dubois didn't get poisoned, if Dubois didn't get poisoned, then Floyd Schofield shouldn't get poisoned either, and shit like that. Like, I don't think, like, because it's just more of like, if it was intentional like that, like it would have been both of them that would have got poisoned. But it's hard for me to think that that Dubois would have got poisoned like that, And it's just even if because like if he's the A side, it's just like they both got poisoned, and shit like that. So that's what I'm saying. So it's just so if like that's what I'm saying, and shit like that. So like if they didn't poison Dubois, they're not gonna poison Floyd Schofield, and shit like that, And that's the thing and shit. But on to, you know, what these fighters bring to this fight that, is that I mean, what and their skill sets, what are they gonna bring to the table in this fight? With Floyd Schofield, he utilizes good boxing skill, strong boxing skill, and shit like that, and overall, and shit like that, like when it comes down to fighting in close range, and shit like that, or trying to get into closer range, like that's his own type of fight, and shit like that, and he's a beautiful, he's a beautiful forward boxer, and shit like that, where it's like he boxes forward, and shit like that, and that's the thing. And he carries power again, and stuff like that. He's also, because these are lightweights. And overall, he's a pretty lean lightweight, and shit like that, Floyd Schofield, and shit like that, so that's the thing and shit like that, so I feel like that's gonna definitely play a big factor, and stuff like that in this fight for Floyd Schofield. And then obviously, with Tevin Farmer, and stuff like that, like he does very good with, with this fluent movement, and his all around, boxing, like with his all around boxing, and shit like that. Like he could box in the inside, the outside, he can move around very well, and overall he could do it at a high level, and stuff like that, and that's the thing with Tevin Farmer, and stuff like that, so this is gonna bring a very, very tough fight, and shit like that, but what these fighters need to do to win and shit like that is that overall, like I'm gonna start off with Schofield. Schofield, like he needs to be patient in this fight, because if he fights too reckless in this fight, like it's just like I'm just gonna say Tevin Farmers is gonna win this fight, and shit like that, because he wants Floyd Schofield to be under pressure like that, to have anxiety in the ring like that, and shit like that, and that's the thing and shit like that. What I mean by anxiety is that, he wants him to be, uncomfortable and shit like that. He want him to want to be in that soft mentality, to think a certain way, to try to fight, to try to throw, and and to kind of be reckless so he can pick him apart, and shit like that, so, seen some on the TV, damn. But because I'm rewatching Bivol versus Sullivan Barrera, and stuff like that, when they fought each other. But yeah, and shit like that, and hold up. So basically, yeah, and shit like that, so, um that's the thing and shit like that. It's like Tevin Farmer wants that from Floyd Schofield. For Floyd Schofield to be, uncomfortable, and shit like that, and that's the thing and shit, so, and, so he needs to be able to fight in his own type of fight, and shit like that, where he's being patient. And overall, he needs to be the counter puncher. Because the one thing with Tevin Farmer that will beat Tevin Farmer, and I have seen, honestly, of all the times that he lost, is that he's got counterpunched, and shit like that. When you counterpunch, Tevin Farmer, and beat him to the punch, and shit like that, with the counters, and stuff like that, like you can be able to, like, that's the thing and shit like that, beat him to the punch, or beat him to the punch with the counters, and shit like that, like that's how you can be able to beat Tevin Farmer. Because Farmer, it's like, he's like, because he moves around a lot, like when you disrupt his game plan, when you're throwing punches like on his most vulnerable times and shit like that, where basically that's when he's moving around and shit like that, not trying to get into range and shit like that, like because Tevin Farmer isn't going to stop moving. He isn't going to just go and just want to squabble, and shit like that, because especially going against a guy like Floyd Schofield and shit like that, it's like he's probably gonna, he's gonna fight in the inside, but he's not gonna fight in the inside like that, and shit like that. He's gonna be very cautious that, if he takes too many shots in the inside, he's gonna end up getting hurt, very bad, and shit like that, and that's the thing and shit like that, with Tevin Farmer, and shit like that, um, so that's the thing, man. He needs to counterpunch, and stuff like that. Be patient, be poised. Just because all around, if he's poised, and stuff like that, and if he could be able to get the punch, and counter well in this fight and beat Tevin to the punch, like overall, like this shouldn't be a tough fight for Floyd Schofield, and shit like that, like honestly, like I just feel like I mean overall Tevin Farmer is gonna still bring a tough fight, still win rounds, but at the end of the day, it's like, either that Floyd Schofield would find a way to come back, or that, he would just dictate the fight all through, and shit like that, or, it'll be competitive at first, but then, it would, end up, being more in Floyd Schofield's favor, and shit like that, where it's ending up not being very close. Like maybe like an eight, like basically like an 8 rounds to 4 type of fight. Like that's like in the middle, and stuff like that, But that's the thing and shit. Like if he could be able to do that, he could, like, he's like, in my opinion, he shouldn't like have a problem with winning this fight, and shit like that, But it just, I seen many of fights where Schofield is being a little too just reckless and shit like that, like, because of course you throw your punch and you do what you got to do and shit like that, I mean, every fight is different, and shit like that, like that's the thing, every fight is different, and shit like that, and that's the thing and shit, but hold on, let me refresh my brain. And so basically that's the thing and shit like that, so Floyd Schofield, like, because there's been fights where it's like, again, like he would just throw wild, and once, it's like, he, like, the one thing is that he fights smart, but sometimes he gets a little overconfident, and shit like that, and that's the thing and stuff like that, like, but he needs to be, but as long as he's poised, as long as he's patient, picks those moments well, and shit like that, where where he can be able to throw his combinations, then everything will be fine, and shit like that, but that's the thing, and shit like that, and so the biggest thing with him is that, is just patience, and just pick your moments, and shit like that, of when to actually throw your combinations, and stuff like that, like don't just be super reckless with just throwing your punches, and stuff like that, because Tevin Farmer is a vet in the game, and shit like that, and that's the thing and shit like that. So you gotta make sure you're on your P's and Q's and shit like that, and and know what you gotta do, and fight smart, and shit like that, instead of just fighting more just with physicality, and shit like that, But yeah, and shit like that, with Tevin Farmer, and stuff like that. What Tevin Farmer needs to do to winning this fight and stuff like that is that all around he just needs to outsmart Schofield. Because overall, when it comes down to who has the more of the fight IQ in this fight, I will give it more in favor of Tevin Farmer, and shit like that, for a good reason, and shit like that, because Tevin Farmer knows how to, like, because Tevin Farmer is always patient with his punches. He always picks his moments at the right time, and shit like that, and that's the thing and shit like that, but this is something that can easily be changed for Schofield. But I'm just saying, like, but in this kind of scenario, and shit like that, of what I at least seen, and stuff like that, Farmer has the more IQ in this fight. So he needs to be able to really utilize that, outsmart, Schofield. Because if he outsmarts Schofield, with his boxing skill, and shit like that, Schofield isn't gonna know what to do, and shit like that. Because Farmer's picking his moments, picking the moments of where he can win, where he's gonna, get the more punches, the more effective punches, and shit like that, and then also he's defending, those punches of Floyd Schofield too, and shit like that for his own worth, Tevin Farmer, and shit like that. So that's why I more think that he would be more of the smarter fighter. If he utilizes that, that he's the smarter fighter, he could definitely win this fight, and shit like that. He just needs to really just, again, pick those moments, and shit like that, and especially when Schofield isn't really being very smart on what he's doing, and shit like that. That is definitely the moment of where, he needs to start, like dictating the fight with his fight IQ, and shit like that, because, and that's the thing and shit like that. And also just, you know like the biggest thing, and shit like that, is I wouldn't say for Tevin to just press Floyd Schofield like that, but I would like to see him tap Floyd Schofield, like tap tap, with the punches, and shit like that, and then eventually catch him with power shots, and shit like that, because overall that's gonna look good, but then that's also gonna confuse, Schofield, and shit like that, because he's thinking that he could be able to walk through a lot of those punches, but then once he starts feeling those punches and shit like that, then basically he's gonna start respecting you and shit like that. So it just, he needs to utilize every little thing and shit like that to look good, and shit with his fight IQ to win this fight, and shit like that, and that's the thing. Even like, just look better with the pressure fighting, like, because they both like to fight in the inside at times and stuff like that, and that's the thing. So it's like he could definitely be able to be the better fighter, land, because overall, like if I would say who's the quicker puncher, I mean, I'm like that Tevin Farmer is the quicker puncher. So he could be able to get those punches out, in time, and shit like that, so then basically, so then Floyd Schofield doesn't do anything, and that's the thing and shit like that, so this is gonna bring a really tough fight, man. And the reason why I got Tevin wearing a belt, and shit like that, is because, Tevin, like we know that he was a champion and he's fighting still like he could still get a belt, and shit like that, and that's the thing, like he's still really good and he's highly ranked, and shit like that in the lightweight division, and stuff like that, so that's the thing, and shit like that, so this is gonna bring a very, very tough fight, and stuff, and overall, it's like, I know that, that Tevin lost twice to Zepeda, but the first fight, I thought he beat Zepeda the first fight. I thought with the knockdown and then overall like his accumulative punching and shit, he won that fight. Second fight, Zepeda won. I will say Zepeda won that second fight, and shit like that, But it's just either way, both fights it could have gone really either way. But I mean, but I mean, I would say the second fight, Zepeda definitely clearly won that fight. But either way, it's like put Zepeda. I know Zepeda is fighting Stevenson, which he's gonna give Stevenson a good run for his money, a little bit, and and shit. But but either way, like I'm gonna share my opinion on that fight when that fight comes about, and shit like that, and that's the thing. Yeah. But basically, my final prediction for this fight, so basically the early rounds, I'm gonna give the early rounds to Floyd Schofield. I just feel like, because Schofield, like, Schofield, like he's more of like the stronger boxer, and shit like that, and he almost kind of has like a little bit of like that Errol Spence type of style, where it's like he has just like a strong, everything is with power, the jab, like the right hand or the belt or like the cross, basically, and shit like that, or like any of the punches, and shit like that he throws, and shit like that, like That's the thing and shit like that, like it doesn't matter. It's like he throws with power, and that's kind of like how Errol Spence fought, and shit like that, and that's the thing. And I feel like that's gonna kind of give him like more of like, and overall, I feel like that strong boxing skill is gonna give him the benefit of the doubt in the early rounds. But I do have Devin at least winning a round. Tevin. I mean, I if I like I like if I said Devin throughout this time, I'd be so mad, bro. But Tevin, and shit like that. But with Tevin, like I have him at least winning a round because with his good boxing skill, and shit like that, and that's the thing and shit like that, and he's pretty good, with this. So overall, like, I have him like winning a round, and shit. But then, the mid rounds, I have it in favor of just excuse me. But so basically I have Tevin winning, the mid rounds 3 rounds to 1, and I have him winning, the mid rounds, 3 rounds to 1, and then after that, I have, the later rounds. But basically the reason, like, I'm gonna just say, because since I did with Floyd, but basically the reason why I'm picking Tevin Farmer, in this fight, and shit like that, is because, I mean Tevin Farmer in not in this fight, and shit like that, But the reason why I'm picking Tevin Farmer in the mid rounds is because, like Tevin isn't gonna be playing no games, and shit like that. Like no matter what, it's like, he has the experience. He knows he has what it takes. He's not like he knows that like this blood in the game and shit like that. He's a talented dude in the game, and shit like that. And that's the thing and shit like that. So like there's no way he isn't gonna be winning like like rounds, and winning a good chunk of rounds, in this fight, and shit like that. I do like it's hard for me, to not see that, and shit like that, I mean it's hard for me to not see that, yeah, and shit like that. But then the later rounds I have it being even 2 rounds to 2, and shit like that, So, I calculated this all beforehand, and shit like that, and so basically I have this fight even 6 rounds to 6. So in my prediction, I think this fight is gonna be even, of a draw, and shit like that. That's my prediction, is a draw, and shit like that, because I just feel like it just both these fighters have a lot of to fight for, and shit, like. Floyd Schofield, like he knows this is a tough fighter, like especially off of the press conference, like he knows what he's going against, and shit like that, and that's the thing and shit, and so he knows what was gonna happen, like that this is gonna be a tough fight, but I just feel like that, like that no matter what fight it is and shit, if Tevin wants to win, like his losses, and shit like that came from more of just like lack of, wanting to win, or just basically, or just a biased decision, and shit like that, or a close fight, and shit like that, and you know if Tevin really comes into this fight wanting to win and shit, which I mean, in the last fights that he's fought, I mean, he's proven that he wants to win, and in the press conference, it's proven that he wants to win, and shit like that. And in my opinion, and shit like that, I think that he's gonna want to win, and shit like that, so that's gonna play a big factor in this fight, and shit like that, while like with him outboxing, Floyd Schofield, outsmarting him, landing the more shots, like in moments. But overall, I do see Schofield, like landing consistently that jab. That jab is gonna be live, and shit like that. But it kind of depends on how he does it. But overall, like I'm just gonna say that his jab is gonna be live in this fight, and shit like that. And I feel like that's gonna be his biggest factor and shit like that, And overall, I do see that like body shots in this fight being a big factor, and overall his combinations, and shit like that. Like I do see him like getting like pressing the action, and shit like that, and getting to work, Floyd Schofield, and shit like that. I see both of these fighters going to work, and shit like that. So it's really hard for me to just pick. Soon I'm about to, say like if I had to pick, but I'm just saying like, it's really hard, man. Like it's just like I know that Tevin lost his other fights and shit like that, but I just like I feel like, cuz I just feel like, that the boxing community didn't really know that Tevin Farmer was really going to come out of off the couch like that and fight like that. I mean, he fought well against Raymond Murataya, gave him a chance, and shit like that, and overall that was an even fight. But obviously that was, in on Golden Boy, which this fight's gonna be on Golden Boy too. So that's the thing, and shit like that, so but it's also MVP promotions too, but basically that's the thing and shit like that, is that, hold on, let me refresh my brain. But yeah, but I'm just saying this is gonna be I just feel like this is gonna be an even fight, man. And overall, like this fight is on Golden Boy, and shit like that. But I feel like that's also why, Tevin Farmer is gonna be fighting a lot more harder because he isn't really getting as much of the benefit of the doubt anymore because there's a lot of fighters now that's getting fame, that there's a lot of talent, and shit like that. So it's like he's gonna have to fight a lot harder. And I feel like in this fight, like in overall, like I feel like Tevin Farmer is gonna look good in every single fight that he has, and shit like that, and prove that he's still a contender, and he's also gonna win fights, and that's the thing, and shit like that, and yeah, and shit like that, but overall, and shit like that, I do see this fight being a draw, and shit like that, but if I did have to pick somebody to win it, like, other than it being a draw, I probably would lean a little bit more towards Floyd Schofield, because he's just more the younger, more fresher fighter, and shit like that. He does carry more power, his punches are more effective, than Tevin Farmer's punches at the same time, and shit like that, and he knows how to throw, a lot of punches too, and shit like that, so, and he's accurate too. So it's like, I feel like that's gonna play a big factor in this fight, and shit, when it comes down to Floyd Schofield winning. So if I had to pick with somebody winning this fight, I would probably go with Floyd Schofield I would say by a very close decision, and shit like that, like, but I'm just gonna say a decision. If I'm gonna say what the judges are gonna pick, if it's a decision for, for Schofield, I think it's probably gonna be, I would say between a unanimous and a majority decision. I'm probably gonna lean a little bit more towards a majority decision because I do see, like other judges having different opinions and shit like that, because either way, I see this fight being close. And that's the thing. When I need to drink some water, and stuff. And yeah, and that is the thing, man. And but yeah, but if I'm gonna say if it's gonna be a draw or Floyd Schofield, I'm gonna go with my first answer, and stuff like that, of a draw, and shit like that, because it's just like overall I respect both fighters. Both of these fighters got game in the ring, and shit like that, and both of these fighters have whatever it takes to win, and shit like that. And it's just overall, you know, it's really hard for me to just see it going any other way besides it being a tough fight. Like both of these fighters, like I don't see both of these fighters like either way. I mean, they can, anything's possible, but I just feel like with both of these fighters, what they can do, I just feel like it's not possible for it to be, like more of a one-sided fight, and shit like that, a close fight and a one-sided fight, or like a blowout, I don't see it being either of it. I just see it being just an all-around just really close fight, and shit like that, so yeah. But that's my final prediction. I got this fight being a draw. And like I have this fight being even of a draw, 114 to 114. But if I'm gonna say who, like, pick somebody to win, Floyd Schofield, just by a very close decision, and shit like that. But make sure you guys like and make thank y'all for watching this video. Make sure you guys like and subscribe. I'm Preston. Peace out.